A convicted Omaha spree killer appeared virtually in court today. After asking the system to put him to death for the 4 murders back in 2013, Nikko Jenkins is changing his tune. Jenkins' attorneys filed a motion wanting experts to examine his mental ability. They would focus on 2 aspects here: his intellectual ability and his adaptive behavior. Those exams, depending on the outcome, could determine if his intellectual capacity makes him ineligible for the death penalty. The state objects to their argument. They say a precedent decision brought up by the defense happened before trial, and Jenkins' case is past that. The judge said he will review the cases presented to him before making a decision.